Hi everyone. In this episode of Versus, I'm going to be comparing two large explorer ships, and those ships are Origin Jumpworks 400i and the droid Corsair. They're both considered to be competitors, which are idealized as being the next step up from a medium-sized exploration vessel like the Freelancer Der, while not quite being on the same level as more dedicated ships like the Carrack or the Odyssey. And they could be more accurately described as being on the smaller end of the large category when it comes to exploration. There's also one other ship that fits within their same tier level, which is the Explorer variant in the Constellation series, and I'll be talking more about that later on in another video. But for now, I like to just focus on comparing the 400i with the Corsair. And that's mainly because the design philosophies that were used in building these two ships seem to be polar opposites from one another. So let's start things off by taking a look at the 400i. Origin primarily focuses on luxury, and their ships tend to be built around this principle with everything else being a secondary concern. They mostly prioritize defense over firepower, and their ships are often faster and more agile than any of the other competing vessels that fall within the same size category. The 400i looks like it was designed by someone who has a postmodernist vision for crafting structure and detail. And Origin spared no expense when it comes to the amenities that the 400i offers and the state-of-the-art safety features that it's been outfitted with. Its outer appearance could be described as looking like a flying yacht that's a fashion model version of an 890 jump. The 400i's sleek exterior hides two decks within a hull that looks like it's barely big enough to hold even one. But despite its outer appearance, the inner structure is surprisingly open and easy to navigate through. When it comes to its technical specs, the 400i has several advantages over the Corsair. It has a higher SCM and max speed. Its pitch and yaw speeds are also faster, and has a hydrogen capacity that outshines the Corsair's by a significant amount. It also has 3 coolers and 3 power plants that are all medium-sized. And that's one more power plant and one more cooler than the Corsair has. It's good to have redundancies within your component setup, because the more of them you have running a system, the harder it's going to be to completely shut that system down. This will also provide you with more opportunities to mix and match the various benefits that comes from combining different types of components like stealth, industrial, competition, and military. And each of them will be able to hold a number of subcomponents that you can use to further augment those abilities. And of course, the more components you have, the more subcomponents you'll also be able to have. The 400i's weapon system consists of 2 remote rear-facing turrets that both have 2 size 3 guns each, while the pilot controls 2 size 4 weapon hardpoints, and they also have access to 16 size 1 and an additional batch of 16 size 2 missiles. And these missiles are mounted onto non-customizable racks, but they can be swapped out for any other type of size 3 ordnance. The 400i has a cargo bay that's located in the lower part of the stern of the ship and is surrounded by 4 escape pods that are all set within the surrounding walls. And the ship has a drop-down lift that's big enough to accommodate a total of 42 SCUs of cargo. It isn't going to be able to carry anything that's rover-sized or bigger, but it can be used to transport any vehicle that roughly has the same dimensions as a Cyclone. It can even carry a bunch of small vehicles at one time like the Mule and the Steve. And of course it has enough room to be able to transport any of the Gravlebs. The only Cyclone-sized vehicles that the 400i has issues with are the MT, the TR, the Rock, and the Rock DS. And the issue isn't with them being able to physically fit inside the bay because there's plenty of room for them. The issue is that there isn't enough clearance for them to be able to get under the belly of the ship and onto the ramp. And one of the most unique features of the 400i is the scouting bay that's located in the bow of the ship. And you can actually see into it if you go to the EVA room and look through a window that's located on the other side of the gravity generator. This small bay was designed to hold an X1 Gravlev bike, but through experimentation I found that it can also fit a Nox, and technically it should also be able to hold any of the Ranger variants. It can carry a Greycat PTV, but it looks like the STV is going to be just barely too big for it. And unfortunately, the Dragonfly in its uncompacted mode isn't going to be able to fit onto the ramp. I think that at this point it goes without saying that the Pulse also fits into it, and the Pulse practically fits into everything. And I'm a little surprised that it doesn't have a harness that lets you carry it around like a backpack. But there's nothing that prevents you from using this space for more than just carrying small vehicles. And I'm pretty sure that some of our more enterprising citizens have already found a whole slew of other kinds of uses for it. Like, for instance, you can store several small boxes on it. This will give you easy access to items like surplus equipment, medical supplies, food, and extra ammunition. And the nice thing about it is that the scouting bay is sealed off from the rest of the ship, so you don't have to worry about decompression. And unlike with the lift for the rear cargo bay, potential shipjackers aren't going to be able to use it as a way to try and sneak aboard. And if you really want to get creative, you could just use it as a makeshift prison or as a temporary hold for sketchy passengers. There's certain things about how this ship's inner structure is laid out that I really like. And one of those things is that they place the elevator dead center of the ship, which makes it easy to get to any of the rooms that are on either side of the two decks. And I like how the 400i has a separate cabin for the captain that's just slightly better than the other crewmen's, just so they can walk around with that smug sense of superiority that every Origin captain by law is required to have. Also, its components have been placed in a centrally located room that's going to make engineering gameplay a lot easier to contend with, which is unlike the chaotic nightmare of network components that some of the other ships are going to end up having. And the flight deck has a gorgeous unobstructed panoramic view of the surrounding vista. In fact, the whole setup makes me feel like I'm sitting at the helm of a mini 890 jump. The aft portion of the habitation deck is where most of the ship's amenities are located. Along one wall is a fully stocked kitchen and has additional storage space, a sink, a trash bin, and a fridge. Across from it is a booth that could easily seat 4 people, and the entire room is ringed by a singular curved window that overlooks the rear of the ship, which has a clear view of the aft turret, so your crewman can have a front row seat to watch as your rear gunner turns pursuing ships into vulture food. I also like how they've set up the EVA room to act as a nexus point where both the docking collar and the main entrance connects to the body of the ship. One entire wall is dominated by 4 large lockers, and the room itself is spacious enough for a decent-sized away team to be able to gear up all together at the same time. The 400i is an additional feature that you aren't going to find in many other ships of its size, and that's a hollow table which is intended to be used as a command and control center. And this additional level of functionality is going to allow a player to control a fleet of ships via a holographic interface, and it's conveniently located right in the middle of the habitation section. So why would somebody want the 400i rather than the Corsair? The two main reasons are aesthetics and gameplay. The ship is going to be appealing to anyone who gravitates towards sleek ships that have clean lines and a modernist look. And the type of gameplay that it offers caters to people who would rather display the greater part of valor when it comes to combat. But just because you can avoid a fight doesn't mean that you have to, and I'm not trying to say that this ship isn't capable of holding its own. It just means you're going to have a lot more options when it comes to picking and choosing when you want to fight, instead of letting your aggressors dictate the terms of combat for you. Now, I've spent a good amount of time with this ship facing off against both NPCs and other players, and in a lot of these conflicts it was the rear gunners who were the ones who ended up getting most of the kills, and that's because a lot of the enemies that we were fighting just kept lancing with us. So the front guns would end up tearing into them during their approach, and then the 2 rear turrets would finish them off as they sped past us. And the 400i may not have been specifically built for combat, but it still does a decent enough job at fending off attacks from any small to mid-sized enemy vessels. The downside to it is that when compared to the Connie and the Corsair, the 400i is the most limited when it comes to its weapons, transport options, and its carrying capacity. And I feel that a good way to try and overcome those limitations would be for you to look into getting something that could act as a mobile base for you to visit between missions, like maybe the Liberator or the Ironclad, just to name a few. And getting that type of vessel could be a great in-game goal to set for yourself as being the next ship that you're trying to work your way up towards. The Drake Corporation has been responsible for waging a marketing campaign that almost entirely centers around spreading distrust for the government and any of the institutions that support it. And they've embraced this notion that they're empowering civilians with the ability to defend themselves so that they don't have to rely on the military or advocacy for protection. While in reality, their vessels have been responsible for committing more pirate raids than all the other ship manufacturers combined. And Drake ships were built to be less expensive than their competitors, and they do this by cutting every possible corner that they can legally get away with. They often outfit most of their ships with low-grade components. They have unfinished interiors, thin hulls, minimum levels of amenities, and no safety features. But to compensate for that, they generally tend to give their ships an inordinate amount of firepower, and the Corsair is no exception to this. It's supposed to be Drake's answer to the 400i and the Constellation Explorer. But the running joke with the Corsair is that the only exploring they're going to be doing is using its size 5 guns to explore the inside of your cargo hold. The pilot has access to 4 size 5 weapon hardpoints, 2 of which are mounted onto a turret, and has 2 more size 4 weapon hardpoints on the port side wing. The pilot also has access to 8 size 3 missiles that are all mounted onto 4 customizable racks. Altogether, this is one of the most impressive allotment of pilot-operated weapons that you'll find on a ship of its size. The Corsair has 2 manual turrets on each of its flanks that are equipped with a pair of size 2 guns, and it has a remotely operated rear dorsal turret that's armed with a pair of size 2 repeaters. Performance-wise, the Corsair has a couple of advantages over the 400i. First, and oddly enough, it has a superior roll speed. It also has a slightly larger quantum fuel tank, but it's only larger by a marginal amount. And the Corsair has its own list of things about it that really makes it stand out from the other ships, and I mean things that go beyond the amount of weapons that it carries. The first is its uniquely asymmetrical look. Asymmetry is a difficult thing to pull off for a ship design, and that's mainly because it's all about creating something that's made from unequally sized proportions while also managing to instill within it an inherent sense of balance within the structure. And it's something that's easy to get wrong, but I think they really nailed it with the Corsair. And the second standout feature that's unique to this ship is the elevator. The Corsair uses a central lift that could be used as a secondary entrance, and it goes all the way from the roof down to the galley and out to the surface. And another thing that gives this ship its own unique beauty lies in the little details you find riddled throughout it, like for instance in how the kitchen is set up. They just had to put the bathroom right next to the front dining table and chow line because Drake. The entire kitchen setup makes me feel like I'm sitting at that one booth in a restaurant that's right next to the bathroom. Now imagine that everywhere on this ship is that booth, and it feels like they intentionally went out of their way to do that, which perfectly fits with that perverse sense of charm that you're only going to find on a Drake ship. And speaking of aesthetics, the Corsair fully leans into the very same type of style that's attracted a lot of Drake enthusiasts to this manufacturer in the first place. Things like stray cords that hang from the underside of the pilot's console, the fact that nearly every wall is exposed, and everywhere along the ceiling are dangling wires that seem to have been pulled right out of an electrician's nightmare. Even the unique looking levers that they've built for operating the lift perfectly complements the style of this ship. Another unexpected surprise with the Corsair is that each crewman gets their own private room, and each bunk, including the captain's quarters, are the same size and have the same basic layout. So there's not going to be any captain's privilege going on here. The only privilege the captain gets is that their bunk is on the bridge, while the rest of them are all located in the bathroom/kitchen area. The co-pilot seat is another unique feature of this ship. It drops down and pushes forward so that it rests directly below the pilot. This whole setup kind of reminds me of how Dr. Evil would dispose of one of his underlings, which kind of makes me like it even more. And the Corsair also stores most of its components in a climate-controlled room in a way that's very similar to the 400i. Unfortunately, it has to keep a few of its larger components in the cargo bay, but they're still all located very close to one another, and centralizing them like this is going to go a long way when it comes to making your engineer's life a lot easier. One of the final standout things that the Corsair has is an armory that's located just outside of the airlock. You know, just in case there was any questions at this point as to what kind of exploring the Corsair was being used for. The cargo hold of the Corsair can hold 72 SCUs, and it's also big enough to carry a full-size rover in it. In fact, it's big enough to carry a Merlin or an Archimedes. It could also carry up to 4 Furies at one time. The Corsair can easily transport all the Cyclones that the 400i has problems with, like the MT and the TR, and just to show off, it can carry any 4 of them all at once. It can also be used to transport a Rock and a DS. You can carry a bunch of smaller vehicles like the Nox, a Dragonfly, a Steve, a Hover Quad, a PTV, the X1, a Ranger, a Pulse, or a Mule. And as you can see here, the Corsair can pretty much carry almost all of them at the same time. The Corsair is also one of the few ships that can be used to transport a Storm, which takes up the entire bay, but still you can do it. Just make sure that you remember to retract the turret before you drive it in. You can also carry the Storm AA, which actually fits a little better than the Storm does. There was also a debate going on as to whether or not it could carry a Pisces or any of its variants, and you can get one inside of the cargo bay, but it barely fits. So you can do it, but there's going to be issues that goes along with trying. So why would you want a Corsair rather than a 400i? Once again, the answer to this is based on what your aesthetics and gameplay preferences are. Drake has got its own unique art style that really leans into using motifs like raw struts and exposed wires. Its consoles have physical buttons, dials, and levers. The rooms have a claustrophobic lighting scheme, and you're not going to find a lot of interior windows throughout the ship. If you sat back and closed your eyes, you could almost sniff the ionized smell in the air and feel the rust coming off on your hands as you touch the walls. And it's about as opposite in appearance as you could possibly get from an Origin ship, and that's exactly what a Drake owner is looking for. When it comes to gameplay, the Corsair is an aggressive ship that's meant for people who are more combat-oriented, and it really tips the scale when it comes to how powerful a civilian-class ship can end up being. Another reason why you'd want to choose this ship is for its multi-role capabilities. And in that aspect, its vehicle transport capacity is only second to ships like the Liberator, the Hercules, or the Ironclad, which were specifically designed for vehicle transportation. The biggest downside to the Corsair is its speed and handling. It was always intended to be the least maneuverable compared to the Connie and the 400i. And having a lot of forward-facing firepower but a slow pitch and yaw speed means that this ship is going to be better at taking on larger targets than it is smaller ones. It's easy to take a look at its massive forward-facing battery of weapons and get an inflated sense of where you stand in the pecking order. I may have admittedly had a little of that going on at one point, but I snapped right out of it after seeing someone in a Razor take on a solo-operated Corsair, and after a long, drawn-out battle, the Razor ended up single-handedly destroying it. And I realize that that is an extreme example, and there's a lot of gameplay features that are coming in the future that should help to mitigate this kind of action, but for now, it was a grim reminder that every ship has a weakness, and you have to respect that. Another thing is that when they start finally balancing these ships, Drake is always going to end up being on the lower end of the armor and durability scale when compared to its other competitors. And the last downside of the Corsair is that it doesn't have any safety features. That means there's no escape pods or ejection seats aboard this ship. What I really like about CIG's design philosophy when it comes to ships is that there isn't supposed to be a meta, which means that in competitions like this, one ship isn't going to have a clear advantage over the other. And the purpose of these Versus episodes isn't to throw two ships in the Thunderdome just to see which one's going to come out alive. Instead, I want to give you as much information as I can so you can choose for yourself which ship is going to appeal to you and your playstyle the most. I look at the 400i and the Corsair as being the next logical step up for people who are progressing through the game as intended and are looking to purchase their first large ship. Both of them are great multi-purpose vessels, and they're perfectly capable of being operated by a small crew or even a solo pilot. They're also great ships to act as a long-range small mobile base that you can use for dual-stage operations. And by a dual-stage operation, I mean missions that require you to have to use a ground vehicle or has some FPS elements to it as well as ship combat. So no matter which one you end up going with, the only way you could lose out is if you ended up picking something that contradicts your individual taste and playstyle. And I hope that this video helps people to avoid doing that. Well, that's going to be it for this Versus episode. I've been your host, Law of the West. Thanks for watching. Take care.